everyone, and welcome to Dignified Resilience. I'm very honored and privileged that I'll be talking to Jeff Sharlet today in today's episode of our podcast. Jeff is an award-winning literary journalist, the nationally best-selling author of The Family, Sweet Heaven When I Die, and the director of creative writing at Dartmouth. His work has earned numerous awards, including the National Magazine Award and the Outspoken Award. Today, we will discuss Jeff's new book, The Brilliant Darkness, a book of strangers. I've had this book for a couple of months now, even before the pandemic, and stay-at-home orders came in place. I like the title when I saw it out because that's the kind of stuff that I've been into recently myself, both into exploring darkness in its various forms, and then this idea of brilliance and that contrast of possibilities. So when I saw it together, The Brilliant Darkness, I was curious and I was intrigued also by this photo, which I thought was so beautiful on the cover. And I like the book too, so I'm very excited that its author accepted to, come along and talk to me about it today. Shortly, it's a collection, a book about as a collection of the strangers whose stories Jeff shared or which they shared with him, and kind of, as he said, attempting to find narrative together. So first, Jeff, thanks for being my guest and welcome to Dignified Resilience. Before we dive in, I just want to ask you, how are you today?
I'm healthy today. It's sunny outside, and maybe you just sort of have to take that as enough. My family early on, for whatever reasons, we had some sickness, and I live here in Vermont, and the local hospital said you need to be tested. So we went through the hard quarantine early on, and ever since, it turns out we were negative. We were just sick. Ever since, we've just been living in our isolation and trying to, I think, at least trying every day to adjust our minds toward what is to come, to face that darkness, as you put it. The title of the book, This Brilliant Darkness, comes from actually the last line of the book. And it refers to just down the road from where I'm sitting now. There's a beautiful field that for years now I've been photographing. And I oftentimes in the morning or at dusk when there's interesting light, and my kids have grown tired of me pulling over on the way home and saying, I got to just jump out and take a photograph of the field, and thinking about this darkness. And I don't use any high-tech camera stuff, so it captures what it can. And so sometimes an image is almost nearly just darkness, but there's a luminescence to it as well. And that's this brilliant darkness with which I am coming to terms. And I think that actually is a condition that many of us, or maybe all of us now, find ourselves in. We are in a time of great darkness, and we have to confront that and try and find that brilliance and that illumination within it.
Absolutely. I think that the reason why I came to the idea of inviting you on is because I am starting to reread. I actually started rereading this book kind of 10 days ago because honestly, it soothes me in a way. I think that the way you normalize, I'm thinking, in terms of first the title and the way that you described, and at the end of the book, exactly, you elaborate on all that. I think a lot of people might benefit from that calming, accepting way that you describe it. And in the book, you actually write, darkness isn't the absence. Darkness isn't the absence of light. It's the presence of ink.
Yeah.
Stuff from which letters and words and stories are made. Darkness moves. It flows from one letter, from one image to the next. And when you, like you said, I think it spoke to me so much when you said this brilliant darkness with which I'm coming to terms, that, it's there, it's then the sentence, I think it was, I don't necessarily want to shine a light that dispels it, I want to live with it.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, for me, my spiritual grounding helps me, or has helped me throughout years, to kind of normalize that situation in terms of, I mean, not situation, the state of mortality, I think. And then my background from the Balkans, where we've been through so much, makes, I can't say it makes disasters easier, because every disaster is a disaster of its own, and darkness has many manifestations, as I say, from wars to, you know, consequences of pandemics to loss of job, loss of loved ones. But I think that what, like you say, in these days with this pandemic, just normalizing this state of insecurity or uncertainty is what we need, right? How do you...
I mean, uncertainty, and also the sort of the certainty of mortality. You know, the book began for me in a different kind of darkness. It starts in 2014, and my father had a heart attack, and I live in Vermont. He lives in upstate New York, and I would drive back and forth, about a 3.5 hour drive over the mountains. There's no straight road, just winding path over the mountains to go and take care of him. And I found myself driving most often at night, and for all sorts of reasons, practical reasons, but also because an insomnia that had always been with me had grown stronger. I spent many years as an investigative journalist, as a journalist out in the world, collecting stories, and those stories had added up for me. I'd always, I'd made the mistake of thinking, you move from one story to another. No, they accumulate. This is like the smoker who thinks the only cigarette that's hurting him is the one that he's smoking right now. No, it adds up. And the stories had kind of added up, and it was keeping me awake at night. And so I would find myself working the night shift, and I started looking around for who else was awake at those strange hours. And, there's a whole world of people. We know cops and nurses and warehouse workers and the businesses that stay open 24 hours, and the person who gets the night shift. And it can be very lonely in that darkness, and unless you sort of look around at who else is there with you. And right, that's not shining a light on it. That's not dispelling it. That's looking around at who else is there with you. So, and I was doing that literally. Who else is with me in this night? Who else is with me as I'm sort of looking at the mortality of my father, and the sort of the troubled in my own mind. But you say uncertainty, and that's the one thing that there is no uncertainty about, right? We are going to die. Mortality is a sort of, we come to terms with that. We have to come to terms with that, because we're not going to escape that. My father, when I was a child, I begin the book with this, his favorite Emily Dickinson poem was "Because I Would Not Stop for Death, Death kindly stop for me." And that's so true and so obvious that it can seem trivial. And yet here we are in a moment now where the United States as a nation and many countries around the world are actually struggling to grasp that essential truth, and to grasp it not as a form of fatalism, but as a call to imagination, right? Yes, we face this, mortality is clearer now than ever. So we could either look away and pretend and like, no, we're going to open our bowling alleys and whatever, or we could say, who else is with us in this darkness, and how do we find solidarity together? And that's what my book was about, on the small scale of everyday people. I would not have imagined it would suddenly become, in my reading, it feels metaphorical to the moment that we're all in right now.
Yeah, and it feels that, you discovered Instagram, and you write about it in your book. And I think a lot of cynics, and you say social media cynics point out that, this is from your book that I'm quoting, are laid on a matrix that Instagram is a form of submission to a distant corporate intelligence. True enough, we should not mistake the Instagram square for a public one, but nor should we miss the dignity afforded by the small solidarities of hashtags the solidarity of recognition, of seeing one another. I really like how you said social media cynics, because I think that I could totally imagine the kind of criticism that could come to this book, and it was exactly what I thought it would be. And I think that it's my personal opinion is those, I think, cynics who don't want to accept the offering. And I think that you also explained so nicely and elaborated in the book, because you said the pictures I've been trying to take are not the story, right, of these people. There are some passages and moments in it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so as you said, the book began with Instagram. Actually, I was sitting, I was getting ready for a night drive. I was in upstate New York. It was already late and I had to drive home to get my kids. And as a writer, I've always had this practice of when I get stuck on a story, I'll go to the comic book store and I'll buy some comic books. I loved comic books as a kid. You know, I still like graphic novels and so on, but I'm not, I buy these in sort of moments of distress. And what I'm looking for is the motion between panels. Here's an image, right? Comic books artists call this the gutter, the space between panels. When I can't figure out how to make my sentences flow, I'm looking for that. And I remember sitting there, I'd gone to the comic book store because I was exhausted. I had a deadline. I didn't know how to keep going. I thought I'll just buy this comic book and I'll look at it and maybe it'll spur something. And I had signed on to Instagram for the same reason most of us do, friends, family, that kind of thing. And I looked, oh, these are panels. Oh, this is a comic book. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a comic book artist, but I can't really draw. But I could take pictures and I could write the words and I could set these things into motion. And to me, this was already then a great solace. And that hashtag, I spoke of the sort of who else is on the night shift. You know, the book begins where I live in rural Vermont. The only place that's open late at night if you want to get out of the house and work is a Dunkin' Donuts. So I'm sitting at the Dunkin' Donuts and I noticed the night clerk, and he's wearing this t-shirt with this very Baroque skull on it, which is not the Dunkin' Donuts uniform. And I get to talking to him and talking about his last day in the job. He hates the job. He's been working this night shift. He has a little tear tattoo under his eye. It's for his child who died. And we have this surprisingly intimate conversation, and I take his picture and I put it on Instagram. I ask, you know, and I write a little story and I hashtag it night shift. And then I say, who else is awake right now? And, you know, this is me discovering a hashtag, right? Oh my God, there's hundreds of thousands of people. There's people now posting right now, people with shitty jobs that they don't like. There's a whole genre of night shift pictures of warehouse workers who take selfies of themselves getting high as a kind of way of flipping the bird to bosses that they hate and so on. This is their way of seeing each other in the darkness. And yes, it is mediated by the corporate platform of Instagram. I am no champion of Instagram, but let's not be blind to the ways in which, given the constraints, we find ways to see one another. And I think that's what I mean about that. Yeah, I still see it now when people very knowingly declare the problems with social media. Yes, yes, and yes. And there's a level to which I note that many of those people who knowingly declare these problems are people who live in cities. Well, I live in a very rural area. And, you know, before the pandemic, there was days when that social media was the way I got to talk to other people. And now here we are, right? And we're all living in a rural area, and in some ways we're all living in the isolation of our homes, or should be, at least. I suppose some of us are rushing out to hair salons and so on. I think it's worth remembering then the sort of that possibility of recognition, and that it takes work to see one another through all the noise of social media. Yeah, you have to work. It's not just going to happen. You have to work and try and recognize one another.
Yeah, I think that even without social media, I think making connection through initial conversation or context is just the start. And that's the thing, that it takes work and it takes time. Yeah. And I think before pandemic, we were always so um, obsessed with how busy we are, and there was never time for this, and that is how that connection and space for it becomes lost. So I think that taking time to meet somebody and also to work, like you say, is valid with technology, social media or not. But I am among that group of people who, despite all the, online bullying included and the harassment that can happen, depending on the context on the social media, really finds the benefit and the possibility to connect. And one thing that one of the many things that I liked in this book is you were talking how, at the end you said, what I hope you see, what I have come to see anyway, is just how relative beginnings and endings are, how they too move according to the light. And now here we are in the pandemic, where everything and the idea of time is so relative, and the idea of beginnings and the idea of endings as well. So I was wondering, how do you reflect upon that idea of time right now, in terms of the beginning and the ending?
I mean, the book, as you say, it's comprised of, in some ways, a series of fragments. These are encounters. The subtitle is A Book of Strangers. And, we spend longer with some. There's a long central story about Charlie Kunang, a man who was killed by the LAPD, and I go to everyone who knew him and try and rebuild his life. And then some of them, it's just a page. Many of them, it's a snapshot and a page, an encounter. It's not an attempt to tell the story. It's just a story from that moment. And I think that fragmentation was very appealing to me. Partly aesthetically, I've always just been interested and came to journalism actually through writers like James Agee, who were skeptical of those traditional kind of narrative arcs and implicitly the politics that happens in the story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The power that's being exerted. Here's where this story begins. Here's where it ends. I mean, we all know. I mean, it's become a punchline. Sorry. It's become a punchline in sort of political rhetoric. Remember George W. Bush, mission accomplished, right? The idea that the story ends here. Or Donald Trump the other day saying, we have met the challenge and we have prevailed, right? Watch out for someone who declares an ending. Watch out for someone who declares a beginning. That's not how time works. And the book was for me, my attempt to sort of recognize that and live with that and say, oh, these stories, where does this begin? Where does this end? How do we also resist that kind of framing? In writing about this man, Charlie Kunang, who was an unarmed Black man killed by police, an all too familiar story. He was a houseless man on Skid Row in LA, Cameroonian immigrant, pinned to the ground by a group of officers. Last words were, "Let me express myself," and that enraged one of the cops and pinned him down, and they shot him through the heart. Shot him 6 times, and the killing shot was what's called a contact shot, where the muzzle's pressed right to the bone while he was pinned down. I mean, a horrible, horrible murder. And as I spent time with his story, and I looked at the ways in which the LAPD tried to frame it, and I know I'm getting into the specifics of that, but I think it speaks to the larger question of framing. They pointed out Charlie had been a bank robber. He had robbed a bank. It's an almost grotesquely comic story. He wanted to be an actor. He came to America to be an actor. He got into Actors Playhouse. How is he going to pay for his acting lessons? Well, he's seen this he loves Robert De Niro, and he's seen this Robert De Niro movie Heat, and he knows when you need money, what do? You pull a big heist. So we got together a couple of other aspiring artists. A guy wanted to do a record label. They studied the movie a long time. They said, okay, we'll rob this bank, and that will launch our artistic careers. So we'll use that money. And instead it destroyed their lives. But the LAPD said he'd robbed a bank. They said he was a drug user. Yes, he was. They said he had a history of some violence. He did. And what this has to do with holding a person, unarmed person down and killing them, I do not know. It has nothing to do with it, but it's this idea of inevitability, that this is how that story has to go. And it's what I speak of in the book as the temptation of tragedy. The temptation of tragedy, it's a powerful temptation. I mean, all of us who love literature know it, is the illusion of inevitability, which itself is this kind of reassuring, after the fact consolation, that things as they are, whatever the horror is, it was always doomed to be thus, right? That's a narrative frame. That's the knowing frame. Yeah, no, I knew all about it. Oh, so you're upset about Donald Trump, whatever. Well, I knew about America's problems before that. Well, no, it never is inevitable. We both have to simultaneously recognize real loss, because Charlie is dead. That's done. He can't come back. It was not inevitable that he die. And I think that's, to me, and I don't mean to keep extrapolating to the moment, but it's how I'm sort of thinking through this book and the work that I'm doing now, is I see this almost sort of daily desire for a narrative arc, right? That's what reopening is. It allows me to feel sympathy for the reopeners with whom I'm politically not aligned, but I understand it. This is the story that when they go to the movies, this is the story they see. This is the story they read over and over. So, okay, a bad thing happened. We went through it. And now it's supposed to be the resolution, the arc. Sympathetic character encounters conflict, achieves resolution. History isn't working like that. And they're trying to impose this narrative frame. I do think it'll have disastrous results. But I think we do ourselves no favors by calling these people fools. These people are only embracing the narrative logic with which we tell stories, until we start thinking about how else can we tell stories that don't have to have that beginning and end, that fixed frame. Can we start creating a space in which everyone else can sort of wrestle with, and here's the uncertainty that you spoke of, the deep, deep uncertainty, the ending of this. There won't be an ending to this. There will only be a movement towards something else. Coronavirus may go away. It's not the ending. And in the same way that coronavirus didn't begin in February or January, or did it begin, when to begin in 1918, or where do you begin it? Darkness moves.
And I mean, speaking of one immediate darkness that I think of is that there is going to be a big mental illness crisis, I think, not just in the United States, of course, but everywhere where geography defines and describes kind of the inequalities and inequities, whether it's wealth or health, I guess. So, and even though WHO, the World Health Organization, a couple of days ago, they warned of a looming mental illness crisis as the result of the isolation and the fear and the uncertainty and the economic turmoil. And what was interesting to me is that Deborah Kestel, the head of the WHO's mental health department, who presented this report, basically she said that we could expect surge in the severity of mental illness, notably in children and healthcare workers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I thought it was interesting specifically also because I read that you kind of lately read a lot of dispatches by medical Reddit, which I must say I didn't know existed. So I learned that.
I learned about it through a friend who's an ambulance driver, and really powerful stories of these folks describing their experiences. And I think about that. So there's two things I would want to say about that. I think about the mental health situation of frontline workers. And I remember as I was doing this, when I was working on this book, I was in a period of kind of breakdown, which ends, and here's the spoiler, right? The book begins with my father's heart attack. 2 years later, in the same room in which I learned of his heart attack, I write what I believe is the last word of the book. I'm like, that's it. That's the final sentence. That's great. And I found my way home. I found, I was lost and now I'm bound, and I'm pushed myself back from my desk, and what's this? Why do I feel so horrible? And I had a heart attack, right? So I think at that time, I sort of spent this time struggling with like these stories that I had collected. I had a heart attack at 44. It was a weird age to have a heart attack. They had taken a terrible toll on me in stress. And I said, well, this doesn't make sense. There's no, I mean, one, I'm not a war correspondent. I've never been interested in that. I've been in some scary places. The stories that hurt more are not the scary ones, the sorrowful ones that the person really transmits to you and that you carry with you. But I said, compare it to any EMT, emergency room nurse, cop, social worker. I've seen nothing. They've all seen more. And now on the one hand, we know that those professions do have mental health challenges and addiction challenges and so on. On the other hand, they also do have structures and forms, right? I think of this in the way people who've never done any courtroom reporting and they've only seen trials on TV, imagine this great drama. And then they go to an actual trial and discover it's one of the most boring things in the world. And it's supposed to be boring, right? Drama is not the stuff of justice, in fact. Drama needs to be slow and procedural and so on. So it is normally for healthcare workers, right? You go, you see some great distress, you file your report, there's paperwork, you contain it in your mind if you can, you do healthy practices. Those containment in all ways is broken now, right? They don't have that ability to distance themselves from what they're encountering all the time. I think of a great Instagram account to follow is a former student of mine, Riada Starheim. I think it's called Riada EMS, and she is an astonishing writer and is working as a paramedic right now. And it's thriving in some ways on the sort of the adrenaline of the moment and the feeling certain of the moment. She's very forthright about her mental health issues. She's struggled with them. She's dealt with suicide attempts of her own and so on. She writes about all this and so on. And you see that laid bare. But the other thing I want to say is, even as we see the surge in mental health problems, I think what's also happening now is what's always there is more visible. And I think about this in terms of isolation. I don't know, this won't work very well. I'm going to hold a picture of one of the sort of the heroines of the book. This is a woman named Mary Mazur. She, at the time, was living, and I don't know if you can see behind her, that's her bed in a transient motel, and it's covered with groceries. So she carves out a little space for herself amongst her food. Her bathtub is filled with her food. She doesn't have a refrigerator, so she puts things between the glass and the screen, and when she wants to thaw frozen food, she does it till it's room temperature, and she eats it. And she's been doing this for 40 years. She lives in severe isolation. She has real mental health issues. And she's there. She's always there. Every town you go through, I live in, quaint rural Vermont. Down the road, there's a little motel, and you might drive by and say, oh, look at that quaint motel, the Shady Lawn Motel. It's the same kind of motel. It's actually a motel filled with those who are houseless, homeless, filled with those sex offenders who are constrained by law about where they can live, oftentimes end up filling those hotels, which is not a good situation for anybody. I feel like the current moment now is making us hopefully become aware of how much struggle there is all around us. Right in the beginning of the book, I mentioned the guy with the skull shirt at Dunkin' Donuts. I ended up writing a lot about Dunkin' Donuts night shift workers. And if you go get a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, pay attention, because, my God, someone's like, oh, someone's just got a job, and they get to talking to them. Well, where do you live? I live in my car because I only get 4 hours between shifts. And so I am almost working in this constant slave mill routine. mental health issues will follow that kind of structure as well too. We can think of the pandemic, the silver lining of the pandemic, as a call to seeing, right? Even if we must do so through the mediation of screens.
And while we think about these scenarios and visions of the future, I think it's important to not forget those who passed away. And I think COVID fallen, as you know, one of the hashtags that you, I think, started, and the way that you also retweet faces of COVID, I believe, is
really
literally we forget. We talk about numbers and we look at the news, how many people died, and these statistics. And I think always about statistics, whether it's about how many people died in Bosnia, how many people were still found, you know, here today, how many bones were left over, and it's like, and always it is so crucial that we remember these people had aspirations, they had their stories, and just to remember them as well. I think something that I really appreciate. Because we forget, and it's thanks to these hashtags or these accounts that we forget that we are all human in a way, right?
Yeah, if you're watching this podcast and you haven't heard of Faces of COVID, this Twitter account, if you're not on Twitter, go get yourself on Twitter so that you can follow this, because what they're doing is really they're obviously working a lot, making this effort to sweep the whole country for the obituaries. And it's one of the things, I think there was a piece in the Times about this, and it was the thing that was troubling me. Why are we not hearing more of the stories, not only of the deaths, right, but of the lives that lost? Because at first, a lot of the obituaries would be, so-and-so was a bus driver. Anyway, he got sick on March such and such and such. It was how they died. And that was actually a big thing for me in this book, was the story of Charlie Kunang, this man who was killed by the LAPD. And I remember at the time I was talking to a friend who writes on these kinds of matters of representation. And he was thinking about Black Lives Matter and how, for so much of the press, it seemed the only Black death mattered, right? You know, you would know just the thinnest of story. Like, who was Michael Brown really? What were the lives that were lost? And I said, okay, that's what I want to try and do. So with Charlie Kunang, I said, I will tell you about how he was killed. I mean, I went, and I'm also an investigative reporter. I got some leaks from the LAPD so I could see the body cams of the killing that they were trying to hide. And, I did all that work, and I tell you that, but I want you to know how this person lived. And what we need to see now are these portraits of the lives that are lost, ordinary lives that are lost. I mean, to compare it to 9/11, when, we had those 3,000 some faces that were so powerful. And if you were in New York at the time, and to walk anywhere and to see everywhere the pictures of the dead. Mm-hmm. We're visual people. Now we have at least 85,000 confirmed dead, and as studies show, probably in the United States, more in the vicinity of 100,000 already. And many people don't see these pictures. The newspapers run some obituaries, but not many. And we need to see this. And people say, oh, but that knocks me down. And I kind of feel like, yeah, you need to be knocked down. Mm-hmm. And that's part of coming to terms. Part of coming to terms with darkness is saying, this hurts. It hurts a lot. The loss is unbearable, but here you are, you're still alive. So you're going to keep bearing it. Pay attention to that verb that we use so casually, bearing, right? We speak of bearing witness, right? It's a verb. Witness is something you carry. It's a weight. And you've got to say, all right, I'm going to carry this. I see these deaths. And there's nothing I can do to save that person now, but at least I can carry their memory. And that's worth something.
As we read myriad articles about how post-COVID age is going to look like, what's the new normalcy, I think we can't know. One thing that we can know and what we can do is do some self-inspection. Which, I mean, if we talk about resets and, global reset, the vision, how the world is going to change, well, I always think that it might not change, and that for some people it might stay the same as it is, and that's not a good thing. But if anything, And a thing that I'm trying to do with this podcast is to offer these stories and the work of people who do the similar thing as an invitation for self-inspection in terms of what we can do, how we can, acknowledge the realities that we might not have maybe been recognizing around us, or, in terms of the people who are next to you in a line for coffee or not. But at least I cater to the crowd in the community who, like me, feel that there is possibility and space for that connection. You also write in the acknowledgments of your book how you made that book for your daughter and your son, and how that you made it as a way of returning to them from the darkness in which you had been for a while. And I feel that for each of us, that whatever it might be, that bigger sense of meaning and purpose always helps us in those dark times. And it can be a new sense of purpose that what creates in a global pandemic or kind of the change, or it's something that is an ongoing thing based on experiences or work. But how do you think, what do you think about this? I mean, how did your kids help you? As you say, you made it as a way of returning to them from the darkness.
I said before that I had this second heart attack, or not second heart attack. My father had a heart attack, and then I had a heart attack 2 years later when I thought I was finishing the book. And the line that I was writing, that I said, and this is the only time, and this is my 7th book, the only time I've known, like, oh, that's it. That's the last line of the book. And it's describing, this sounds terrible. Aspiring writers never write about your dreams. But every now and then you do, and I did. And I was writing about the sort of dream that I'd had. And in the dream, I sort of stagger home after this sort of horrible sort of encounter. And my daughter says to me, "You were gone a long time." And I wrote that, and I was like, that's it. And that recognition that I had been gone and that I was back, right? Both things were true. There was a loss, but also this return. So I pushed myself back from the table, and I had the heart attack. And I remember lying in the final chapter of the book, because now I write sort of a post chapter about that. I remember lying on the table in the hospital, and I remember speaking to the doctor, and I said, "But this drama of the heart attack that you see on TV, like and you fall down. I mean, it does happen, not very often. God help me, I watched this Trump's second debate with Hillary Clinton while I was having a heart attack. Actually, I was plugged up to a machine. I actually could see what my heart was doing, and they're pumping drugs in me, but I sort of wanted to know what was happening. Watching it with a nurse who was a Trump supporter, but was saving my life. It's complicated. But I remember asking the doctor, and I said, "All right, but I'm going to be all right, right?" And he says, "We'll do the best we can." And I said, no, you didn't hear the question. I said, "I'm going to be all right, right?" And he says, "We'll do the best we can," right? And that's all he can promise. And I remember thinking, my mother died when I was young, and her goal had been a breast cancer. Her goal had been to see my sister and I through high school, and she didn't make it. I was 16 when she died, and I said, "All right, I want to see my kids through high school." So for me, that means living to 59. Right. So that gave me a final chapter of the book to write about, like, okay, I need to find the way to do that. That's a small solidarity. In some ways, the most intimate of solidarity with our own children, right? With those closest with us. But it is a solidarity, and it's a model that you can then take out. I want to be alive so that I can be in community with my children. I want to be alive so that I can be in community with others. Right? There's something to live for. I don't want to be alive so that I can, I'm going to make partner at the law firm or something like that, right? You want to be alive so that you can be, that is something to work for. That is work. that you can do for and with others. I think all the, that's a lesson that the people, the strangers, the so-called strangers, um, in this book, and I'm not actually a religious believer, but I take the stranger from the biblical kind of idea. You know the stranger. The stranger is the one to whom you owe greatest hospitality, right? They're teaching you that again and again and again, and not because they're all saints. This is not, I got to tell you, if someone's saying, oh, it's great, he goes around and he encounters people and he discovers the great wonderfulness of everybody. Mary Mazur, who is the heroine of the book, she is who I showed you that picture of, this woman who is living alone in her as she likes to put it, and I'm just quoting her, she says, I am one tough bitch. And she is. And she is a kind of a scary person for the aid workers who are trying to help her. And she can be mean. And she had 3 children taken away from her. And she acknowledges that was the right call. And yet she's human. And yet, if you can bring yourself to recognize that the humanness of this other person, that other person might recognize it in you as well. And you can find yourself in community, as I was fortunate enough to find myself in community with Mary. You can say, oh, this is worth living for. Sitting here in this transient motel, and Mary's room doesn't smell good. There are maggots in the food. It's hard to see in that picture. Sometimes she just wears a plastic bag because that's all she's got. She has one shoe. She can't put a shoe over the other foot. It's got a wound. You can be tempted toward the paternalism of, okay, I'm going to go and fix you. And that was actually where that story began. My mistake. I was insomniac at a late night place eating. Mary was wheeling herself down the street. She had some money. She was going to go to a 24-hour Walmart. She wanted to buy a microwave. It was close to Thanksgiving, so she could cook a turkey for herself. But she was freezing, and she was going to freeze to death. And I called an ambulance. At the time, the preposition matters a lot. I called an ambulance for her. As she would put it, I called an ambulance on her. She didn't want that ambulance. And that's also part of that community, is recognizing, here, how can I help you? Not how can I help myself feel better about you? How can I help you? How can I meet you on those terms? That, I think, is something to live for. I hope other people want to live for that.
And we do hear stories about, despite all the partisanship even and polarization, there are stories about new communities rising, or just the relationships and kind of sparking new things, sparking in terms of connections. And I think that's one of the things that always, not always, but very often happens in these post-disaster scenarios, even after natural disasters or throughout the wars as well. I think that human connection ends up mattering a lot more and can alleviate a little bit all the stresses that we go through in particular moment.
There's a good book about that by, the writer Rebecca Solnit.
Oh, I read it. I love it. I quote it, underlined it.
Yeah, community or A Paradise Built in Hell, right? And it's such a powerful book, and it goes right to what we were talking before about the way these sort of narrative frames can trap us. Yeah. And look, I love the post-apocalypse narrative. I watched The Walking Dead, and the story, consists of like when disaster strikes, we're all going to tear each other apart and so on. The worst will come out. And she shows, looking at history and these disaster zones again and again. In fact, oftentimes, as she's the paradise, the great communities of solidarity and help emerge in these moments. That's the temptation of tragedy, the inevitability, this inevitability of fragmentation. That's not inevitable at all. And I just think that's a beautiful book for the moment in terms of thinking. What another writer I like, Leslie Jameson, in a book called The Recovering that came out in, I think, 2018. And she's writing about creativity and addiction. She is a sober alcoholic, and she's sort of thinking about, what does it mean to try and keep being creative in a way that there's such a long history of, and I'm familiar with this because before my heart attack, I was lucky enough not to be an alcoholic, but only because genetics hadn't caught up with me yet, you know, and I did my best. And she can't take a drink anymore. She doesn't have that. And so she's thinking about 12-step programs, AA communities, right? And the way people share stories in those communities, and the way it brings together people who oftentimes would not be friends out in the world. And she calls it the saving alchemy of community, right? The saving alchemy of community. And I love this phrase. And I kind of, it's sort of like when people say, describe your book, I say, well, there's this line from this other book. I kind of push the other book, the saving alchemy, because that key word, no, alchemy. Alchemy, when we take base materials, right? That's what it literally means. We take base materials and we put them together, and somehow in the juxtaposition, it becomes gold, right? It's magic, it's science. The saving alchemy of communities is kind of wonderful because we can recognize the ugliness in ourselves, the bitterness in ourselves. But as Rebecca Solnit in her book shows us, you bring these things together and somehow there's alchemy, and a small person who might be petty and mean becomes glorious and community, which is, I think, a hope that is available to all of us right now, available and visible if we're willing to look.
Ditto to all of it. I absolutely agree. I think that is, I prefer to be in that group, even though I'm pessimist by nature. I'm really consciously have been in the past few months and years just learning those muscles of conscious hope, whether it's through spiritual grounding and spiritual solidification in my personal case, or also learning from facts and realities in these situations, either after disasters or war narratives, precisely because of where I come from. That brings me to something that I call 5 sweet questions at the end, which people understand very differently. So feel free to respond as you understand. The first one is precisely related to that. Once the current emergency is over, is there something specifically to this period that you would not want to forget, Jeff?
Oh, my answer is going to seem so trivial, but maybe it's not.
Go for
it. I live out in the country, and of course you're working all the time, and I spent much more time where I'm very fortunate. I can go walking for miles without seeing, fortunate and sad, I can go walking for miles without seeing another soul, but I have the freedom to move around and to go with my kids and to sort of do this, a little bit of work that I've always wanted to do. I always wanted to know the names of things, the names of trees and plants and just little grasses and so on. And so we spend a lot of time learning this. And now when I go for a walk in the woods, it's not just like, oh, look at the trees, look at the plants. It feels like that community, if I can speak of it in those terms, is greatly expanded in this sort of immediate sense. And of course, those things can call into mind the human as well, and the friendships and the acquaintanceships and so on. So I am grateful for that, and I want to take that, learning the names of things, not learning the names of things to control them, but learning the names of even the smallest little things. When I can't go out and do the work that I love to do, which is to talk to strangers, well, maybe I can go out and learn about this beech tree, this poplar tree, this sedge grass, and so on. That I hope I'll keep with me.
Wow, now I'm going to think about those things in those terms when I go out for a walk as well. But I do appreciate nature in a new way now, considering that I've always lived in, cities and concrete. Nature has, it's very important for mental health and balance as well. So
you're talking about social media, and I'll say that part of, I've always been trying to learn these things, like guidebooks, and this look like this, the drawing. Social media to the rescue. In this case, there's an app. I feel like I'm an advertiser for it, but God, my kids and I love it, called Seek, and you just hover it over a plant, and because all the other people have been doing it, and you sort of collectively work to figure out what this thing is, and to give, to tell you about the various names of the plant and so on. So, and it's good even if you're in a city, because you'll discover, what is there to see? In a city, you're passing 100 different species of life beyond the human every day.
Mm-hmm.
The weeds and a crack of the sidewalk, there's more going on there than we can normally see. And I think that illumination of difference and life is really hopeful beyond knowing the names of weeds.
Mm-hmm. So which of your personality traits has been the most useful, you think? Not the best trait, but the most
well, probably, I suppose, my reclusiveness. And, it's a book of strangers. I go out and I get the sort of the saving grace of talking to others. And it's an odd thing as a writer. I spend a lot, I go, as any journalist, I go and I talk to strangers, and with this book, it's not strangers because I'm in pursuit of a particular story. I'm just like, hey, hi, what's going on, and so on. But the fact of the matter is I've always done that because I'm actually kind of structurally a shy and reclusive person. So that's probably kind of helpful now. I am okay with long stretches of silence with myself. And that reclusiveness is definitely not the best quality, but at least it sustains me.
And yeah, and that's why, and there's a particular nuance between that, the most useful and the best.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, exactly.
So we touched upon a little bit about the relativity of time, but my next question would be, when you have 30 minutes of free time, how do you pass that time?
I want to have some really great answer, but between, I know you have kids too, so there's homeschooling, and then there's, then I'm trying to teach my own students, and who knows, maybe even do some work of my own. And so when I have 30 minutes free time, I sit in contemplation. Like, no, the thing that I like to do most, actually, everyone's got I'm interested in the sort of the viewing regimes of people, right? Like because we're all watching, not all, but many of us are watching a lot more streaming things, right? 30 minutes, I'm not going to pick up a novel. But I've been watching especially old movies in these like little 30-minute blocks. And something I find very comfortable about watching movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s, everybody in them is dead, this is and why is that comforting to me? Like, I don't want to see a movie with living actors. It's not exactly escapist, because it's a way of sort of thinking about things in a different way, whatever the movie is. So, I mean, good movies, bad. I've seen some great ones. I've seen some bad ones, as long as it's old and from another world, that is as distant from this one as the future I hope to inhabit is from this one. I find it very comforting.
That's so interesting. I mean, there's so many articles out there with the suggestions of which films and which books to read, and then there's so many people who say they cannot focus on reading a book. And I think it's all normal. I mean, I think it's absolutely now that whatever works, whether it's reading, not. I think it's just about finding what works, including the films that you're watching. I have not, honestly, I have envied those people with the lists of things they watched at night. My husband goes to sleep at 9:30 because he's tired, and then I use that silence to read or research. And it's Ramadan now, so I like to listen podcasts about it as kind of in silence as well, whatever helps kind of to go strongly to the next day. And that is why at the beginning, actually, I asked, how are you today? Not how are you? Because I think.
How are you today is right. That's what we should all be asking.
It's not.
And we should carry that. That should be a habit we take out beyond this. How are you today? I'm not
Yeah,
talking about in general.
exactly. Because yesterday I had a bad day, today I'm better, and that's how I think we have to understand it. So, okay, so two questions left. One is, what skill or craft would you like to master, get better at?
I have to admit, there's lots of people like, oh, great, I'm going to use this time. I don't have more time. I have less time now. I've suddenly gone from being a college teacher and writer to being a college teacher, writer, first grade teacher, and fifth grade teacher. And I have no training for those things, right? So I have less time, and people say, oh, all the things I wanted to cook. Are you kidding? Well, we have less time for cooking. I would like to neaten this messy office of mine. I mean, a skill.
But imagine, and, it's all about imagination right now.
Pandemic skill. I'm gonna learn to whittle. I'm going to. I had a friend who a darker frame of mind, although in fact more social media, actually an interesting community I would recommend is to follow Blair Braverman and Quince Mountain on Twitter. And they're both writers, and they're also mushers, which is dog sled racers. And they built this incredible community of people who never cared about dog sled racing. But I think Blair is sort of, now Quince is a racer too, but Blair was the racer, and people were sort of excited by this woman racer, even though she's not the first one. And then these right wingers would attack them and call them ugly dogs. So they started to embrace that name, and they said, we are the ugly dogs. And they love dogs. And I have a dog, but I'm not really into dogs. One of the dog racing dogs is, hey, Malcolm. Almost done, Malcolm. Sorry. God, he seems so urgent. I was like, what's wrong? He needs a cut orange. Anyway, but they're a little bit survivalists. And Q said, you live in a rural area, you should have a firearm, you should have a shotgun. And I'm like, I wouldn't even know how to use it. He says, I'll teach you how to use it over Zoom. I haven't taken him up on that. I don't want to take him up. I'm going to put that down as a skill. I'm going to answer your question with a skill I don't want to learn. Wow. I do not want to learn self-defense.
Wow. Well, speaking of friends, the last question is actually related. Are any of your friends completely opposite to you, or are most of them similar to you?
Oh, I would say a lot of them are. I mean, well, those are two very dear friends, Quince and Blair, and Quince is like, hey, let's next year, they raced the Iditarod, the 1,000-mile dog sled race. They said, did you know there's a 300-mile walking Iditarod you can do through the Alaskan wilderness? Wouldn't you want to do that? And I do love nature and being out, but I don't like being uncomfortable. Or they said, hey, there's a plane that follows the Iditarod to pick up the sick dogs. So wouldn't you like to go with us in a tiny little plane over the Alaskan wilderness filled with powerful, snapping, sick dogs? No, but I love these people very much. So yeah, I would say I think a lot of good friends are. It's interesting to find friends who have deep passions and that you become engaged with and fascinated by. And now I follow dog sled racing a little bit as well, even though I don't even want to visit them at their house because they have so many dogs and they'll jump on you and everything else. And I think we all have that, and it's worth us recognizing that, right? Because then we're compelled to sort of. So what are these threads that are bonding us together? It's not sameness. It's the differences that make things that make things interesting. I suppose that's a banality, right? It's a banality until you actually notice it in practice in your own friendships.
Oh, well, I've enjoyed this conversation so much, but I feel bad for the orange that needs to be peeled. We all have responsibilities as parents as well. So I mean, Jeff, thank you so much. I really, really, truly enjoyed this conversation, and I've learned so much. I will go on and check those applications as well, both for Seek and the ones that you shared as well. And I encourage
nothing from this but this. Get on Seek, everybody, because when you identify plants, then that's going to help me learn the names too. Because the more we make this big database, so that's all that matters. Forget all the rest of it. Just
no, yeah, but that's a great way. Yeah, so it's building connection in the community and kind of trying to find the benefit from it. So and just to remind, beautiful book, The Brilliant Darkness. So thank you again for accepting this. Is there anything at the end that you would want to share in terms of survival techniques or anything, hope, anything that you would want to share with the listeners at the end?
Oh, I think you're just embodying them. I actually said, what is a skill I'd like to learn? And of course, I'm a journalist. I do ask questions, but I have so much admiration for those people who can do podcasts and so on, and who can make these sort of this great proliferation of let's talk to other people's stories. So just what you're doing, I think, is the survival skill. And I have to remember, as a recluse, I have to remind myself, oh, right, that's what I do to survive, is you ask questions about other people's lives. And
it's very humbling. I really, truly mean that. And I said this before, this is coming out of me wanting to connect, but also wanting to hear and present more stories that I wish to hear. In a very humbling way, by listening to others who either want to share their stories themselves or people who have researched things, and just kind of to be in that team that believes that there is a possibility for that better future. And I think that you said that, and I really appreciate that. There's so much darkness, but there is some other vision as well. And being reconciled with one does not mean that we don't and can't aspire to working towards the other. Okay, go peel the orange. Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, stay tuned for more conversations with very interesting people from all around the globe.